Have you ever noticed that some relationships seem perfect from the outside? The couple has chemistry, they enjoy spending time together, they have similar interests, conversations flow naturally. Everyone around them assumes they're a great match. Then a few years later, poof, the relationship ends. When that happens, people often say something like, well, I guess they just weren't compatible. But here's the real question: were they ever compatible? See, as a matchmaker, that's something I've spent a lot of time thinking about. Because one of the most common misunderstandings about relationships is the way people use the word compatibility. Most people think compatibility means attraction or chemistry or having a lot in common. But those things aren't actually the same thing. In fact, some of the strongest attraction I've ever seen has existed between people who wanted completely different lives. And some of the strongest matches I've ever seen weren't built on obvious similarities at all. That's where compatibility starts to get a little interesting here, because compatibility is usually not what people think it is. See, when most people describe compatibility, they talk about things that they can see right away. Like, do we have chemistry? Do we enjoy being around each other? Do we have things in common? Do we make each other laugh? Things that matter. These things absolutely matter. Relationships would be difficult without them, but they're also the easiest things to notice. The harder things to see are usually the things that matter later. Like, how does each person view family? What role does work play in their life? How do they handle money? What does success look like to them? Where do they want to live? Or what kind of future are they trying to build? Those questions aren't nearly as exciting as chemistry, but they're often much more important. And that's why compatibility can be so difficult to recognize in the beginning. The things that create connection tend to show up first. The things that determine long term success usually show up later. I've seen situations where two people had incredible chemistry. They enjoyed being together, they genuinely cared about one another. But as the relationship progressed, they realized they wanted very different things. One wanted children, the other didn't. One wanted to stay close to family, the other wanted to move across the country. One prioritized stability, the other valued freedom and flexibility. None of those people were wrong. Neither person was the problem. They were simply building towards different futures. And that's a very different issue than attraction. Attraction can make two people want to be together. Compatibility helps determine whether they can stay together. That's an important distinction, because many relationships don't struggle due to lack of feelings. They struggle because life will eventually ask practical questions that feelings alone can't answer. How should we spend our money? Where should we live? What sacrifices are we willing to make? What kind of life are we creating together? Those questions eventually arrive in every serious relationship. And when they do, compatibility becomes much easier to see. One of the things people often misunderstand about matchmaking is what a matchmaker is actually evaluating. Most people assume matchmaking is about finding two people who would enjoy meeting. That's part of it, but it's a very small part. The real question isn't whether two people would have a good first date. The real question is whether two lives fit together. Can these people build something together? Do their priorities align? Do their expectations align? Do their lifestyles align? Do they want similar things from the future? Because relationships are not built on first dates. They're built on ordinary Tuesdays. They're built on routines, responsibilities, decisions, compromises, shared goals, the everyday realities of life. That's why a couple can look perfect on paper and still struggle. And it's why two people who seem very different can sometimes build an incredibly strong partnership. The deeper forms of compatibility often exist beneath the surface. They're not always obvious, they're not always exciting, but they're usually what determine whether a relationship can endure. So when people talk about compatibility, I think they're often describing connection. And connection is important, definitely important, but it's not the only part of the picture. Compatibility is something larger. It's not a feeling, it's not a shared hobby, it's not simply chemistry. Compatibility is the degree to which two people can successfully build a life together. And once you start looking at relationships that way, you begin to understand why compatibility is so much more complicated than most people realize.